Breaking overnight, Russia strikes the Ukrainian city of Dnipro again. This after Thursday's attack using an experimental medium-range ballistic missile. And overnight, the Kremlin says the launch was a response to, quote unquote, reckless decisions and actions of Western countries. Ukraine's President Zelensky calling the launch a severe escalation of the war. Joining us right now is CNN military analyst and retired Army Major General James Spider Marks. It's good to see you, Spider. Thank you. This strike in Dnipro, the way the Russians described it was a ballistic missile with a non-nuclear hypersonic warhead with a medium range. The way a U.S. official, Spider, described it at one point yesterday was that it was an experimental medium-range ballistic missile, not an ICBM, as Ukraine's military had initially claimed. Describe for everyone the distinction and the significance in this moment of this new move.
Well, an ICBM, just to get into the details of that, an ICBM would be intercontinental, right? So this would be an extra theater, outside of the theater of conflict type of a missile system. This was not. The fact that it was not nuke tip, good decision on the part of the Russians. I think also Putin is probably sending a message, which is, hey, look at me. I can show restraint. Could have put a nuke on it, and I chose not to. But I think primarily what you see is this was a kind of a very tactical tit for tat. It's a response to the unleashing of the ATACMS that the Ukrainians have that are launching now against military targets on Russian soil, long overdue. And so Putin now this is a card game to Putin. So he just wanted to see that card on the table, and he met that card. And this is what we see right now. I think also that the number of these missiles that they have in this experimental category are probably few. So I don't know that we're going to see this as a significant, it's not necessarily an escalation in the fight. I think what we have is these two pugilists are trying to improve their position, moving toward the administration change out in January, and they're probably going to be exhausted. So I think over the course of the next couple of months, very sadly, is going to be an increase in terms of the volatility and the exchanges that we see between the Ukrainians and the Russians.
And I wanted to ask you about that because as you just said, you think at least some of what is happening now is really a response, not just the tit for tat between the two, but also to the U.S. election and kind of Ukraine and Russia both fighting to improve their position or their argument or their tactical advantage before the next administration comes in. You mentioned the next 2 months. I mean, how bloody could this get if that's some of the motivation that exists here?
Well, I think it really is. The description I would use is two dudes in a, kind of in a very tight fight. They're grabbing each other by the lapel and they're trying to pummel each other, but they're looking over their shoulder to see where that new guy, incoming President Trump, is in terms of his perspective. Ukraine certainly is saying, look, we need your help. We need to end this fighting. Putin thinks the same thing. Look, he's as exhausted as Ukraine, but Russia's ability to withstand and to reinforce the fight truly exceeds Ukraine's. The Ukrainians now are being pushed pretty significantly. Again, their resilience is quite phenomenal. But Russia has this. They've got the size, they've got the numbers, they've got the manpower. And Putin is totally immune to the suffering that those soldiers have on the front lines. So both of them are looking for Trump for some type of not a full resolution, but give us a quick outcome and let's figure out how we want to move forward.
Ukraine's parliament is closed today after a long, intense week in Russia's war against the country. Lawmakers are pointing to the risk of a Russian missile attack on a part of Kyiv where government buildings are located. And there's still plenty of reaction coming in after the Russian president said Moscow launched a new ballistic missile on Ukraine's Dnipro region on Thursday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calls that move, quote, a clear, severe escalation of the war. China is calling for restraint, and British intelligence is warning about instability on Ukraine's front lines. Let's get right to CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh, who is on the ground for us there in Kyiv. Nick, so we now know a bit more about the type of missile Russia launched yesterday. What message was Vladimir Putin trying to send?
That Russia still has technology on the battlefield that it can deploy, and technology, the key part of Vladimir Putin's message, technology that's hypersonic, non-nuclear, and he says can evade all known Western air defense systems. That was essentially the reason why it seems this, according to US official, experimental medium-range missile was used over Dnipro in the early hours of yesterday morning. The skyline lit up by something new. It seemed multiple projectiles emerging from the same missile. That's what's called a MIRV, a multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle. What you'd normally expect to be used on a nuclear missile. This wasn't the case this time. Conventional weapons. Russia trying to show that it had the means to totally thwart Ukraine's air defenses and therefore the West's as well. Details emerging slowly about this. Vladimir Putin claiming it was a Mark 10 hypersonic non-nuclear missile called the Oreshnik. Ukraine echoing some of those specifics and suggesting it's in fact something called a Kedr. We've heard from the United States that they believe it was, as I say, experimental medium-range ballistic missile, but clearly something new here. And that's what Vladimir Putin's trying to say, is that there's more Russia can do in response to the stark decision by the Biden administration on Sunday to allow Ukraine to use its supplied ATACMS missiles to hit inside of Russia. A dramatic change in US policy in the war, one that Ukraine swiftly took use of, also using UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside of Russia as well. That's a remarkable change in the stance of both Moscow and Washington. And just bear in mind, Moscow felt it had to give the US a 30-minute heads up of the use of this missile because they feared potentially it may look on US radars to be something more directed towards Western Europe. Ultimately, I think that is the subtext here, that Russia has new missiles that could fire in that direction and could potentially carry nuclear warheads. That's not what happened here or has even appeared, frankly, in the language, but it is essentially in the background. And we are into a remarkable moment in this conflict, Fred. You mentioned earlier the British intelligence assessment. That's the Ministry of Defence in London. Normally quite rosy in what they say about Ukraine's war effort, but saying yesterday that the front line was unstable, unlike any time it had been since the invasion. That's a euphemism for the fact that nearly every point on the compass, we're here hearing bad news from soldiers on the front line. They are, I mean, this weather is extraordinary, but even prior to it, finding Russia has an enormous tolerance for casualties and is pushing forwards. And just cast your mind back to 7 days ago, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz telephoning Vladimir Putin, breaking nearly 2 years of isolation from Western leaders through that move of diplomacy, essentially to try and curry favour with Scholz's own East German electorate, who was slightly pro-Russian because of forthcoming elections. That sort of started really a diplomacy which may pick up ahead of the Trump administration, but instead we've seen remarkable days of escalation between two nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, where Ukraine has been their unfortunate proxy battleground for 1,003 days now. But in the last week, it felt like those two capitals were ever closer, not to direct conflict, I think that's still far off, but to more intimate involvement against each other in this war. Fred?
All right, Nick Paton Walsh in Kyiv, thank you so much.